Hello and welcome back to the Sacred Plant Healing Secrets Explains webinar. I'm John Malanka, your host and advocate and co-creator of Healing Secrets Explains webinar series. And I'm here with my wife, Corinne Malanka, also co-creator of Healing Secrets Explains webinar series. So thank you for being with us this week, Corinne. And just want to let everybody know this is webinar number 4, Proven Strategies, Not All Diseases Are Treated Equally. So we've had a lot of questions about, what about dosing? Is this a one-size-fits-all? So tonight, we're going to tell you all about that, and I'd like to introduce you not only to a good friend of ours, but a brilliant woman, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, and I'm going to say MD. So Bonnie Goldstein, MD, welcome tonight.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here.
Well, we love having you here. So Bonnie, I'll call you Bonnie, but can I call you Bonnie tonight?
Of course.
Okay, that's how I know you, Bonnie. So Bonnie is a medical doctor here in the state of California. She has a few clinics, but she's one of the top medical cannabis doctors. I want to say not only here in the U.S., but overseas. She specializes in not only in cancer, but pediatrics, and she is just engulfed in her work. She loves what she does. She's connected with these families, and she will do whatever it takes legally to guide families. And she is connected, and she has so many stories that we're going to share with you tonight. But also Bonnie is I always say that a New York Times bestseller author, but she does have a book called Cannabis Revealed, which is available on Amazon, available at Barnes & Noble. So Bonnie, if you want to hold that up.
Thank you.
There's the plug there. So
there it is.
So Bonnie, let's start with what everyone asks us about. Is cannabis a one-size-fits-all type of medicine?
Well, so it's a great question, and I get that question all the time. And really, remember, you can have the same diagnoses in patients, but the way they respond to cannabis is going to be unique and individual because people respond differently to cannabis. So really what I find is first you have to determine what the goal of treatment is. And so, is it to have a better day? Is it to get a better night's sleep? Is it to treat pain daytime and nighttime? Is it to treat seizures? If you don't look at what the goal of treatment is, and it seems simple, but many people sometimes skip over that because they're in a desperate situation and they want to get results. But it's very important to decide what the goal of treatment is, and then we kind of work from there. And so really the key is experimentation with the different types of cannabis, with the different methods of cannabis. Cannabis is a plant, and it's grown by Mother Nature. It's not something made in a factory. There's hundreds of different compounds in the plant, and there's different types of cannabis plants, and they have similar makeups, but as we all know, one strain might make you sleepy, one strain might make you stimulated, one strain might take your pain away, one might actually aggravate pain. And so it's really important to understand that sometimes with the first trial of cannabis, it may not work. And I have some patients that try many different products before they find what works. What we have to remember too is that despite all of us being human and having similar physiology, we respond to things differently. We all know people who are allergic to, let's say, peanuts, and other people are not. Some people like the way Vicodin makes them feel, other people don't. So we have very similar physiology, but the reality is that we are unique in the way we respond to what we put in our body. Now, one thing I'd like to mention is that a lot of cannabis dispensaries are still using the terms sativa and indica, and these are very simplified terms. They're really not very helpful anymore because most experts agree that the vast majority of cannabis plants across the United States have been crossbred. And so really a better way to choose medicine, cannabis medicine, is to look at the terpenoid and cannabinoid makeup. So what are these compounds? So the cannabinoids include CBD and THC and CBDA, THCA, CBM, and terpenoids are the essential oils in the plant. So For instance, if a patient comes in to see me and they're on chemotherapy and really all they want is relief from nausea and from vomiting, they would likely start with a type of cannabis that contains THC, as THC is a very effective antiemetic. I've had people come in and say, oh, I don't want THC, I only want CBD. And the reality is that may not work. And so you have to be open to what these compounds do. But there may be a way to do a combination of THC and CBD for that patient so that they don't necessarily feel the intoxicating effects of THC. But someone who wants to treat, let's say, severe inflammation and doesn't want to feel the psychoactivity or be sleepy, they might use a cannabis strain that's very rich in CBD because, of course, that has the potent anti-inflammatory effects and also doesn't cause any intoxicating effects. So remember, we have to look at what the goals are of treatment, but also look at whether or not somebody is wanting to use it daytime, nighttime, or if they also are used to feeling that intoxicating effect, what we call the high effect, or feeling stoned. Some people like that effect. It helps them step away from their pain. It helps them relax. I've had patients describe it as it's the reset button. It actually allows them to get respite from the condition that's really creating an issue, and then kind of let them start over the next day kind of refreshed and feeling well.
My question is, because I'm just trying to think on behalf of the general public, because I would have the same question. So even to take what you just said and whittle it down even further, so I'm playing devil's advocate. We have two patients, same exact condition, same medical history, everything's exactly the same. Isn't it true still that when you hone in on a dosage that just simply how they metabolize is quite possibly going to be different? So even if you have is it close to the same cases as possible, the bottom line is their metabolism. Is that correct?
Right, and it's not even metabolism, it is so remember, we're targeting, when we use cannabis, we're targeting the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is genetically coded. So how your endocannabinoid system works is based on your genetics. So for instance, we know that with Dr. Ethan Russo's work, that endocannabinoid deficiency is a real condition. And there are people who suffer with migraines, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome. That's the triad that Dr. Russo explains. With that triad, for instance, we know that people who likely have those conditions, and they can sometimes be comorbid, or you just have one, or you have another at another time in your life, are likely deficient in their endocannabinoids, their natural cannabis-like compounds that they make in their body, and the role of those compounds is to maintain balance of the cell messages. And so if you have a genetic disruption of that, then you're not going to be able to make your endocannabinoids, and you're not going to be able to maintain that balance. And the way that you can treat that is by taking cannabinoids from the plant as a replacement. But we know that, like, for instance, I have patients who are, women in their 40s, they have terrible migraines or they have fibromyalgia, and one patient responds beautifully to THC and the other patient hates it. She hates the way it makes her feel. She's only using CBD and she's responding to that. And so there you go. You can have, both people can have that endocannabinoid deficiency, but because of the way the medications interact with the endocannabinoid system, again, that's genetically coded in your body, it's going to give you a different effect. And so it absolutely is what John said. It is not one size fits all. Absorption is huge. Some people are good absorbers. Other people are not good absorbers. And then for metabolism, there's 4 different categories of the way people metabolize, from very poor poor metabolism, all the way up to people who are ultra efficient metabolizers, and they just kind of, it's in their body for 14 seconds. So depending on how much you absorb, and most people don't know this, but even though cannabis is a plant and these compounds are natural, we don't absorb 100% of what we take. If I give somebody 20 milligrams of CBD, they do not, let's say sublingually, they don't absorb it. It's not through the gut is not a very efficient way to take it. Even inhaling, you don't get 100% of a dose. And so absorption varies and metabolism varies. And not only that, It can vary by your illness as well. If you're a person who happens to be in a very inflamed state, you may not absorb very well. I notice in my cancer chemotherapy patients that they often, have tried something before they end up in my office. They're coming to me because they're desperate. Why isn't cannabis working? And I'll say, well, how have you tried it? Well, I tried a brownie and I tried this and I don't feel it. Well, what's going on in somebody who's getting chemotherapy? Their entire gut, from mouth all the way down to the other end, is completely and totally inflamed. I mean, there's a condition called mucositis that patients get in their mouth where the entire lining of the mouth is inflamed. We know now, and there's studies that show that the gut is extremely inflamed. That is not where you want to put medicine that's supposed to make you feel better. And even though a lot of patients want to use edibles because they just feel like that's, they don't want to inhale it, they feel like that's like maybe more drug behavior. But the reality is that we have to understand that it's not going to work if you can't get it in. And there are some people who just don't absorb or metabolize cannabis very well, or they metabolize it too fast. And that for sure is part of the differences from person to person, despite the fact that they may be suffering from exactly the same condition.
Gotcha. And I have a lot of questions. So before I get going, I knew I have to do a disclaimer, and I always forget. So before we begin, I just want to let everybody know the information that we cover today is not intended to replace a one-on-one relationship with your doctor or qualified healthcare professional. So the information is not intended for medical advice. And I know Bonnie is an encyclopedia with not only her experience, her expertise. So we're just sharing knowledge and information on what we have here from the patients that she's worked with, and then as well as her expertise. So I just wanted to throw that in. So I didn't mean to cut you off there, Bonnie.
That's okay.
Two things. I'm going to go right down of your intro. You talked about allergies, about to other meds. We have a lot of clients that call us and a lot of followers from the Sacred Plant, and they say, I think I'm allergic to cannabis. Have you ever had patients that have been allergic to cannabis?
Okay, so I have one patient who is a young man who already has a history of asthma, but it was well controlled, and really he wasn't on any medication. He actually worked in a dispensary, and he was in a small room with lots of plant material, and he was cutting and trimming and weighing and packaging and all of that, and he developed a rash on his arms and some wheezing. And once we removed him from the situation, and he kind of worked in a different part of the store, we got him fine-tuned. His symptoms were gone. I told him he could try it one more time. He reintroduced into that room. And again, the room had very poor ventilation, which I think was one of the issues. He developed the rash and wheezing again. So clear cut, and it may have just been an overexposure. One thing I do want to say is that there is, right now, as we know in California, the regulations for the safety regulations haven't gone into effect yet. And so it's quite possible at the time that there was something on those plants like pesticide or some other chemicals that may have caused it. I can't say for sure. But what's interesting is that when he used cannabis in small doses, he did not have an allergic reaction. So it's kind of a little bit of a paradox there. I've had one other patient who had an allergy to cannabis, not a full-blown allergy. It was more to, she already knew she was highly allergic to lots of different topical type of preparations, but she wanted to use a topical cannabis preparation for arthritis in her hands as a woman in her 60s. And we tried really hard to find something that just didn't have a lot of ingredients in it. And basically what she ended up doing was making her own cannabis with just she took the plant material, heated it up, and kind of smushed it into some coconut oil, and she did have a rash, and she did not have a rash with coconut oil. So it does appear that she had a plant allergy. So it can happen. I don't think it's very common. In all the years I've been doing this, I haven't seen that many episodes. Here is 2 that I can recall.
Yep.
But in general, I don't normally see, and it's similar to a lot of people say they're allergic to penicillin because when they were younger, they had penicillin and they got a rash. It may have been they had a virus that had a rash component, and because somebody gave them an antibiotic maybe inappropriately and they associate the rash with the penicillin. It may not be as common as what we think in terms of allergy, but certainly it can happen.
Gotcha. And I'm going to go back into your whole intro because you touched up on a lot of points here that people had written down in questions. And so one question is, I'll go this way. So you mentioned chemo just a minute ago, and a lot of patients feel that they should do one or the other if they're going to try chemotherapy. And what are your thoughts of that? Combining it, I believe it helps with mood, nausea, and just internal healing. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, it's a really good question because I do see a lot of cancer patients. I'm not an oncologist, so I'm not able to give people prognoses. So if you walk into your doctor's office and they sit down with you and tell you about your prognosis and they say, we know that for your kind of cancer, you can do 6 months of chemotherapy and you're 95% chance of recovering and going on to live a long, healthy life. I certainly am not going to talk somebody out of that. I don't think that that's my role. I never tell anybody whether or not they should stay on chemo or go off chemo. That being said, I see a lot of patients in my office who end up there because their chemotherapy or radiation treatment is not working. They've been on treatment for quite some time, and either they were responding and now they're not, or they just are not responding. And in general, what we find is that remember, cannabis is working through the cannabinoid system and other pathways to kill cancer cells. And again, if you're trying to treat cancer, you have to use usually fairly high doses, although there are some clinicians that are getting success with low doses of cannabinoids for cancer. If you're just treating nausea, vomiting, and whatnot, you're talking about low doses, using it as needed, and it's certainly, I think, a complementary medicine to someone going through chemo. I'm even using cannabis treatment tinctures in the youngest cancer patient I have is a little boy who's 2 years old, and as the mom describes it, it's night and day. This boy came to me with over 20% body weight loss. He had severe mucositis, which is significant inflammation and sloughing of the tissue in the mouth. Imagine you get like a little sore. Imagine your whole mouth is one big sore. It was just, poor thing was just miserable. And since he started low dose CBD and THC, he has gained weight, he's playful, he's sleeping, he's getting through chemo. It's just making life a lot easier. And like I said, the mom describes it as night and day. And she said she wished she had had the cannabis oil from the beginning. It was only after 2 rounds and the really bad reaction that she had learned about it and now is a huge proponent of it, especially since she's seen such a great result. But going back to what you asked me, there are people who claim that you shouldn't take chemo and cannabis won't work as well. Look, this is what the studies show. There's a handful of studies that look at cannabis plus chemotherapy. And I used to worry years ago when we didn't have these studies that when you take cannabis, you may actually interfere with the mechanism of action of the chemo and make it less effective. But it looks like now the combination of cannabis with many chemotherapies actually enhances cancer cell death. And I share that information. I usually, when I see my patients, I ask them for a list of their chemotherapy and I go through the literature to see if there's anything there. One young man that I am so honored to have been to be taking care of him, and yay, he just graduated high school. He was diagnosed 2 years, or I should say over 4 years ago, with a metastatic bone cancer, and came to me in pretty dire straits with chemotherapy not working. Well, it turns out that the chemo he was on, which is called gemcitabine, that's a generic, that gemcitabine, when combined with cannabinoids, had a better result. And it just so happens he was on that, and although he was in pretty dire straits with over 20 tumors scattered in his body, we managed to get him cancer-free within 3 months. Now, is it because cannabis worked alone? Is it because cannabis worked with the gemcitabine? I don't know. But, you know, at this point, it's now 2 years later, he's cancer-free. And like I said, just graduated high school, was able to go to his prom. I mean, he has his life back. I never talk about cure, even though there are cases of cure, because really what we're seeing is extension of life. And I hope it's a very long life. But when we talk about cure, you know, it's hard to know. And part of that's because we don't have enough studies. So, and one other thing I want to mention is that just in the last few years, there's a handful of studies that also show that CBD, cannabidiol, improves the efficacy of radiation for certain cancers. And so there's no question that we know that CBD is actually very protective for radiation, but now we actually have combination. And I'm happy to say that I got my first referral from a pediatric radiation oncologist who said, I want this kid on CBD before I start radiation. And so I do believe that the doctors in the cancer field are starting to look at the studies. They're starting to see the benefits of cannabis, and they are selecting certain patients to use combination, because why not try to avoid the short-term and long-term side effects of radiation and chemo by using cannabis, either to enhance efficacy or to help stave off these unwanted side effects.
I love it, and that's one thing that Bonnie has is years of experience, but her patient stories, and I love these, and we're going to get onto a lot more of these I guess personal stories is what I'm trying to get at. Bonnie, you have a great background on how you got into this. Can you share it with our viewers tonight?
Well, so I trained in pediatrics, and I went into the field of pediatric emergency medicine, worked in a lot of ERs and urgent cares, and then, you know, and I was always one of these crazy people that worked at night. I preferred those hours. Everybody's like so happy because they didn't have to work them. They gave them to me. But I got married and had a child, and you know, when you're trying to be mom during the day and doctor at night, something's got to give. And I lasted about 5 years where I decided, you know what, I got to take a break. So I took a leave of absence just to try to save my sanity because I wasn't sleeping. And during that time off, I had a friend who was ill, and she and her husband reached out to me and asked me about medical cannabis. And just like most physicians who don't pay attention to it, busy in my specialty, I was like, oh, I don't know anything. So I started reading because I had time on my hands. I wasn't working. And since I'm a science geek, I read everything there was, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I just was shocked. And so I talked to an attorney to make sure that I wouldn't lose my medical license. And I went to work part-time in a cannabis specialty office in Long Beach, California. And I just fell in love with the practice. These are patients who they're like your neighbors. They're your best friends. They're just people who want to feel well. And they usually, most of them have tried pharmaceuticals and found either, you know, it didn't sit well with them, or it had such terrible side effects that it actually gave them a new problem instead of curing the problem that they were trying to cure. And after a few months, I was hooked. And so, you know, I haven't looked back, and that was in 2008.
I've heard that a few times. Bonnie has graced us with her presence at some of our conferences, and she's always a top draw for everybody too. So I thank you for that. I'm going to go. So a lot of patients, and I know you shared your story about your patient and friend who just graduated high school. So I think that's wonderful news. What happened? This question always comes in. It just came in today as well. So out of state patients, let me get the exact one here. Can out of state patients, and I'm talking about California, come to California and get a legal recommendation without residency, and that comes in daily. And it's two parts. So why don't you answer that one? So basically, can an out-of-stater come to California, and what are the laws, and what are you seeing, or how do you handle that?
Right. Well, again, another good question, John. So, you know, it depends on your lawyer, and that's really how I look at it. My attorney has advised me that the law says that the California law says this is for ill Californians. And so he's really strict about, me protecting my license and making sure I don't put myself at risk. There's always the concern that if you assist somebody as a physician, that I assist somebody and give them a recommendation within the state of California, but they don't live here, they may take the medicine cross state lines, and then I could be accused of aiding and abetting. Look, you have to remember, attorneys always look at worst case scenario and that kind of thing. But I do listen to my attorney because he's very smart, and I don't want to lose my license. So this is how I'll answer the question. Every doctor has to do what they're comfortable with. So it's really a comfort level. Because of this, part of the law that says ill Californians, I require paperwork that shows that you are a resident of California, and that's what I've been advised legally to do, and for now, that's what I do. Do I do out-of-state consultations? Yes. Have I met with patients in my office who are from out-of-state? Yes. But if they do not have proof that they live in California, I will not give them paperwork. But that's my choice. There are doctors who do not require proof of residency. I've had some patients actually kind of get angry that I won't see them, but the reality is that it really is up to the doctor's comfort level. Different attorneys say different things, and I just think the doctor has to be comfortable with what they're doing.
Gotcha. And I'm a fan of doing everything by the book, but we run into so many patients that unfortunately they don't live in a legal state. Until this last July, I believe, the DMV, you could come to California, obtain a California state ID, and then go see a doctor. So I know a lot of patients, are looking for help or looking for that second chance of hope. You also mentioned too about what happens with the patients. You said it's not about strain or indica and sativa, and it's more moving to the terpenes. So again, what do you recommend for a family that's out of state? Can they go to a recreational legal state? I know California is not there yet. It will be, or it is legally it is, but it doesn't take an effect until January 2018. So that's a huge question that we get in. And another one too is how does a patient figure out which type of strain of cannabis to use, and why is it important for a patient to use cannabis that is tested? And so what are your thoughts on that? And I'm a big fan of testing, but again, for out-of-state patients that don't have access to legal cannabis, they're getting it from a friend of theirs, saying, "Oh, don't worry, I know the grower," or the one that gets me all the time, "Oh, it's organic. Don't worry about it. It's organic." Right. And so it's like, come on. So how important is testing? I mean, you must have seen it. You've seen some cases in your office over these years of untested cannabis.
In general, I don't, we're moving into the testing phase of cannabis. So right now you can go into a dispensary in California and there is untested cannabis and there's tested cannabis. To me, it's a no-brainer. If it's tested and you know what's in it, you can get what you're interested in, or, try, and you can try it. But the reality is if you're ill, you want consistency of results. You do not want to get something that works one day and then you use it up and you go back and they're like, "Oh yeah, no, we don't have that anymore. Try this." And then you go home and it's not good. What's the point if you're sick? This is not how, this is medicine, right? It's not just somebody who says, "Oh, I just want to get a buzz," or "I just want to get high," or something. I mean, you can get high off pretty much anything that has THC in it. It's really about people who are trying to treat conditions, finding what works, and then being able to reproduce that success over and over again. I will tell you that it's not just terpenoids, it's also the cannabinoids, but I'm going to give you an example. As a little boy I take care of who has a seizure disorder, and the parents were able to obtain a tincture, so it's a liquid form of cannabis that had high CBD and low THC. And it was labeled CBD tincture, so many milligrams per ml. And the little boy did great. The seizure stopped. He was now that the seizure stopped, he was able to develop a little bit more. He was smiling. He was happy. Like, the parents were thrilled. So they call the company to go get, or they go in and they get the next bottle for the next month. and they lose, and it's labeled the same way, they
Mm.
lose every benefit. Every symptom that had been gone came back. His seizures came back. His sleep disorder came back. His grumpiness came back. They lost everything. So I said to the parents, and again, the bottles said the same thing on it, CBD, whatever it was, 20 milligrams per ml. I said, ask the company that's making these oils for the terpenoid profile. So we get back the terpenoid profile, and the first one has like linalool and myrcene in it, and the other one had no linalool. The what we were calling the bad bottle had no linalool and no myrcene. So clearly this boy needed CBD plus myrcene plus linalool. And if you're not familiar with myrcene and linalool, they're both terpenoids, which are essential oils that are also found in cannabis plant. They're cross species with other plants. We know linalool is a compound that's found in lavender, and it's very relaxing, and it is also an anticonvulsant. And so for kids with seizures, we don't just want CBD, because that may or may not do the trick, but if you can have linalool in there, you may get an added benefit. So in this particular child, that consistency from one product to another. So it's a little tricky because, initially we thought it was tested, but the terpenoid profile was not included on the medicine. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with cannabis right now, is that many of the products don't include the terpenoid profile, so patients really don't know what's in it. It's really, the labeling is really focused on cannabinoids, and so you'll see THC potency and CBD potency and maybe some of the other cannabinoids, but really the terpenoids, it's very important. I call it the fingerprint of the strain, and if you can figure out which terpenoids are working for you, you are much better off being able to find consistency in your medicine if you can find products that are labeled that way. And so that cannabinoid profile and terpenoid profile are really important. To make a comment about out of state, it breaks my heart that there are patients in all these other states that don't have access and that aren't able to get medicine. I have heard of patients who have crossed over into recreational states to get what they need. And this is why everybody should be advocating, and everybody should be writing letters and calling their congressmen and calling their senators and just saying, look, we have to have this in our state. This is, one of the reasons we now have 28 states is because sick patients, disabled people, veterans, and parents of sick children did not give up, and they fought and fought. And so we are now seeing, we have more states that have medical cannabis that don't. And, we are moving. There's no question we're over the tipping point, I think. But at the same time, these policies, for instance, in Florida, the law was passed a few years ago, but it's still really hard to get cannabis if Florida's a big state, and if you're not near a collective, and if they've been kind of slow to get licenses out, but patients are getting medicine. And, one of the biggest things too is that I think also we have to really encourage our physicians. So all patients should ask their physicians, what do you think about medical cannabis? Do you know about medical cannabis? And, encourage them in a non-threatening way to learn about it. Hey, I read about this and I'm learning about it, and, I bought a book about it, and, I'm hoping that maybe you might be open to this. What I'm seeing is a lot. I've had more doctors reach out to me in the last 6 months than altogether in the last 9 years. So that's very, very encouraging. And I see that doctors are now, they're kind of eager for information.
Gotcha. And we're seeing that quite a bit too. Over the last 7 years, it used to be a big stigma to even discuss this, and now doctors are calling with their patients, which I'm a big fan of. You mentioned seeing numerous doctors contacting you right now. A lot of doctors contact us and they ask us about dosing, and I refer them, of course, to our medical professionals, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. And it takes years of experience. Do you ever have any doctors that kind of get upset with you that it's not just, oh yeah, here's my guidebook, here's the whole thing on dosing, and this is what I've been doing for the last, how many years, all in Cliff Note version. Do they get frustrated with you? Because I've seen that quite a bit. New doctors wanting to jump in here and them getting frustrated that there isn't like a cheating card basically with all the dosing instructions for this ailment. Hopefully it'll be that one day. It'll be like that one day, but right now it isn't. So are you seeing that as well?
Well, in my book, I talk about dosing for adults. Pediatrics is different, and it really is one case by case, and what the child usually, if they're in my office, they're medically fragile, they're sick children, and they need to have someone who is familiar with dosing help them. But in adults, I mean, we joke about this in the industry, but really start low and go slow. That's the best way to do it. You will find the dose that works. You may not if you don't respond to it, but you're not going to harm yourself that way. And so THC dosing is something that, there aren't a lot of studies on really on THC, but we have a drug called dronabinol, which is a synthetic THC, which is on the market. It's approved for HIV wasting syndrome and cancer chemotherapy, nausea and vomiting. And in studies that looked at dronabinol, really the range is 2.5 milligrams up to about 20 milligrams. And with my patients, especially my new and inexperienced patients, I tell them that with THC, you can start very low dose. Now, there are products on the market. For instance, a candy bar that will have 180 milligrams of THC. Now, if I tell a patient to start with 2 milligrams, that means they have to take the 180 milligram bar and cut it into 90 pieces. This is really not the way to measure medicine. It's not realistic. And so I tell patients to look for products that allow them to have small doses. So, for instance, there are candies out there that have 5 milligrams. There's other products that have 2.5 milligrams. If you get a tincture, if there's a tincture, and let's just say it says in every milliliter there's 10 milligrams of THC, then 0.1 milliliter is 1 milligram, 0.2 milliliters is 2 milligrams. It's just a matter of doing a little bit of math. And so you can't go wrong when you start low and titrate up. Think about how doctors prescribe pain medicine. Well, you can take 200 milligrams of ibuprofen, and if that doesn't work, you can take 400, and if that doesn't work, you can try 600, and if that doesn't work, you could try 800. It's the same concept, right? You're trying to find the lowest dose that gives you the best effect, that gives you the desired effect. And so starting low and titrating up minimizes the risk of side effects, but also allows a patient to not kind of jump over the dose that might work. CBD is a compound that has a really wide therapeutic range. I've had patients get results with 10 milligrams of CBD, and other patients need 200 milligrams of CBD. So again, starting low and going up in increments. The downside of doing it that way is that sometimes it just takes a little longer. But if someone can hang in there, and especially if they have a little help from a doctor, if somebody comes in and they say, I have inflammation and, what dose should I start at? I might start them a little bit higher because I have that comfort level, but I don't start people at 200 milligrams. I start them low dose and titrate up because, again, some people will absorb better, some people will metabolize better, some people will just are very sensitive to medicine and they respond. My colleague in Maine, Dr. Dustin Sulak, who is also, I think, going to participate in this, he has found that in some of his pediatric seizure patients that almost, the tiniest little doses, we're talking about almost like a drop of oil, is helping these patients. So we really can't downplay how important it is to start very low and have patience and titrate up little by little over a few days to see really, how the medication, how you respond to it. And I'll be honest with you, that's really often what we do with other medications. I think when something's a single molecule pharmaceutical, we have a insert that comes with the drug that tells us, oh, it's safe in this dose and this is the starting dose. But oftentimes, if you give somebody a certain dose, they'll tell you, that didn't work, that was too strong for me, and they need to back down. So I do think that starting low and going slow is a very good motto to have when you're using cannabis.
Gotcha. And when we were going through this with my father-in-law, that's what we had. I mean, we went into the dispensary. He had stage 4 lung cancer. Of course, we didn't want him to smoke or vaporize. We didn't know the true benefits of medical cannabis then. We just knew that it was going to up his appetite stimulation. And we found a chocolate bar and it said 1 dose. And it was enough to, in my opinion, to
Take down a horse.
take down a horse or a whole football team. And so we went and found a coconut oil capsule. And the only reason we found that or went with that is because it was the only product that I knew I could freeze and just cut into slivers to see exactly where his level of dosing, where his therapeutic window, which I want to get into with you. But also it just made sense even when we met. So we went through this whole microdosing, and then a few years later we met Dustin Sulak, and to hear him talk about microdosing, I said, that's exactly what we did. And people used to doubt us all the time, saying, no, you need to just go at it, full speed ahead. And in our case, I know if we would have gone full speed ahead, which a lot of people say get up to a gram, he would have slept right through everything, his hunger, his appetite, and the outcome, I personally don't think would have been the same. Can you talk about the therapeutic, excuse me, you know what, I'm going to get Corinne involved here. We kept her in the silence for a bit. So Corinne, let's go with a fun fact here tonight, if you could, please. Sorry to keep you in the corner over there.
No, it's not. I'm enjoying listening and researching while I'm listening, but it's so funny. I was looking for fun facts this week. Wasn't finding anything too interesting, and I believe still I'll be fact checking these, but stumbled on this one. 1/3 of American crops of cannabis are grown indoors. Not sure if that is due to laws or the preferences, but 1/3. And also I read that 33%, the obesity rate drops by 33% in cannabis users. Now, I'm not quite sure where they're getting these demographics, but interesting facts.
I've heard that as well, but I've also heard women have higher cases of the munchies than men do. And so since we have an MD here, you want to touch up on any of those?
Well, there was a study that seems counterintuitive, and I think it came out 2 or 3 summers ago, that showed that people who use cannabis had an obesity rate of around 17%, and people who did not use cannabis had an obesity rate of 25%. And so there you go. And people often ask me why. Well, one of the things we know is that our endocannabinoid system is inherently in control of our energy metabolism, our appetite, how we use our energy stores. And so we definitely know that there is a link between your endocannabinoid system and how your body uses calories. So that's number one. The second thing people might laugh at this, but if you use cannabis and you get a good night's sleep, you're not up at 3 o'clock in the morning eating leftover pasta. I mean, that's the reality of it. So many of my patients are not stress eating. They're not up in the middle of the night eating. They're finding that, I mean, across the board, like 90% of my patients who have came to me with sleep issues report that they sleep beautifully and it's changed their life. Now imagine you're sleeping terribly. Do you feel like going to the gym the next day?
Oh.
Do you feel like making a salad? No, you're going to go through the drive-through, hit the couch, and fall asleep. So I find that many of my patients say, I'm starting to feel well because I'm sleeping better. Sleep is so restorative. And then they'll say, I started walking and I started preparing my own food. And now I'm exercising because I'm getting up early and I'm well rested. I hit the ground running. And so there is this kind of lifestyle improvement. And it's not just, I really want to say, it's not the plant. It's the fact that your endocannabinoid system, which is Dr. DiMarzo, who's a huge cannabis endocannabinoid researcher in Italy, he said the endocannabinoid system is essential to life, and it sends messages that determine how we relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. And when you think about that, that's kind of our core being. That's our quality of life. When people come into my office and they say, I don't relax, my appetite is a mess, or my, eating is a mess, my sleep is a mess, my immune system's a mess. We're talking about the endocannabinoid system. And so when you get that back into balance by enhancing the endocannabinoid system using the compounds in the cannabis plant, you just get this overall sense of well-being, and I just think it kind of spills over into your lifestyle choices. And so you start to make good choices. You don't blow off the gym, you eat healthier, and so on, because you feel better. And when you feel better, you want to continue that. Nobody wants to go back and forth between feeling well and feeling lousy.
And I agree with you, Bonnie. Sleep is needed, and I'm guilty of that. If I miss a few nights of sleep, or I'm tossing and turning, and I turn into a grump, and so my anxiety goes up. But a lot of patients will call us and say, they call us about medical cannabis, and they say, can you put me in touch with someone who can get me a lot of medical cannabis? I have anxiety. I need help with my anxiety. And I'll say, how's your sleep? And they say, what do you mean? I said, because a lot of times the domino effect, and they say, well, I'm not sleeping. I said, see if you can get a couple of nights sleep and give us a call back and see how your anxiety turns out. And so, not all the time, but we do get calls back and say, you were right, I did need sleep. And so, I'll, talk to you guys later. I'll book a consult down the road. Question that comes in quite a bit as well is, how does a patient figure out which way to take cannabis? And so, do you want to touch up on those? And I want you to also go down and then end with suppositories, because I know, I share your thoughts quite a bit with patients
Sure.
who call about that. So,
Sure.
So again, how does a patient figure out which way to take cannabis?
Okay, so there's numerous ways to take cannabis, and it's in general not a good idea to pick a way unless you know the details of each of those ways. So what I do with my patients is I go through each way. So I'll say, okay, so inhalation, why would anybody inhale cannabis? So we know that inhaled cannabis allows for more immediate effects. If you're in terrible pain, you're throwing up, you're desperate, this will get it into your system immediately. And, there's videos online where you can see a patient who has symptoms, then takes a puff, and within seconds, really, they look like they're better, and they'll smile, or they'll start eating. They were just throwing up and now they're eating. I mean, it's really amazing how quickly it can work when it goes through your lungs. The duration of onset is about 4 hours. If you tell me I don't want to redose every 3 to 4 hours, I want to take a dose and be able to function the whole day, then maybe inhalation is not the way. And I just want to make this one statement about inhaling is I see a lot of patients who are new or inexperienced with cannabis, and the inhalation they kind of associate, and it's with like drug behavior. But I tell everybody, if inhalation works, and for some people it really is the best way, and I don't think that people should write it off. I certainly say let's try other ways, but if we're not successful, then I would say reconsider it. And the reason that I do that is because when you think about vaporizing medicine, it's the same way that people who have asthma take their medicine, and it's a very efficient way to get the medicine into your body. If you are sick, throwing up, you have a migraine, and the migraine's causing terrible nausea, if you eat a piece of chocolate, it may not stay down, but also you're not going to feel effects for a couple of hours. And so I just think inhalation should not be written off, and that I think the whole stigma and propaganda of inhalation it needs to just go away. So that's the first way you can take it. When we talk about ingesting cannabis, people can eat it. It comes in candy bars and I've seen cannabis lemonade, I've seen cannabis ice cream, I've seen lollipops, all kinds of ways that you can take it. And basically anything that goes into the stomach, so tea, any which way that it ends up in your stomach is considered ingested. This route has the longest delay, so 1 to 3 hours. Even some people, it's been described up to 6 hours later. It really depends again on how you absorb and how long it takes to get through your system. But the biggest, and by the way, it will last 6 to 12 hours depending on the dose that you use. When you eat THC specifically, so if THC is in the edible that you take, or in the drink, in the tea. THC gets absorbed through the GI tract and goes to the liver. Your liver breaks down THC, metabolizes it into a cousin compound. The cousin compound also has an intoxicating effect and can be very potent. It can have a sedating effect, which can be very potent, and it also increases the half-life of the experience. So whereas inhalation may wear off after 3 to 4 hours, when you eat cannabis, you're getting somewhere between 6 and 12, and that's because of that conversion in the liver, and that's either called the first pass effect, or they call it the liver effect. I get a lot of patients that come in who are elderly who say, oh, I just want to eat a cannabis cookie because it seems like a nice way to take medicine. And I say, ooh, maybe you don't want to do that because it's the most common way to overdose. It is unpredictable how much you're going to absorb and how much your liver is going to convert. I don't have a problem with it, but it has to be taken in very small doses, especially for new or inexperienced patients. And so, a patient's experience is very important in terms of whether or not edibles are to be used. I do know patients who are using very high dose THC. They've been patients for years and cannabis is working for them, and they can tolerate a 50 milligram dose through an edible. Remember, they probably don't absorb all of it, but at the same time they have higher tolerance. But this is something that we don't see in new and inexperienced patients. A very common way that patients are using cannabis is under the tongue, sublingual preparations. It's very popular, and I think partially because it's a very easy way to control the dose. You hold it under the tongue. There are studies that show that the longer you hold it, the more you absorb. For some people, the onset's within 15 minutes. I have patients that will say that they get pain relief very quickly. Other people say there's a delay of 1 to 2 hours, but by the time it kicks in, and a duration can vary. Again, if you metabolize quickly, it could be as quick as 3 to 4 hours, but for most people, it's somewhere between 6 and 8 hours. Many of my adult pain patients like sublingual. It's discreet. They can carry their medicine with them. They can, if they have some CBD in their purse, they can, take it while they're out at the movies or something like that, so that they can still take their medicine when they're out and they don't have to worry about anybody, knowing what they're doing. Topical cannabis is a very common way to use cannabis. I have a handful of elderly patients who only use it topically. They're a little bit still nervous to take cannabis internally, but it works great for their arthritis pain. And certainly this is a really nice way to avoid any intoxicating side effects. It's just you slap it on where the joint pain is. It also can be used for eczema or psoriasis. I've had patients use it for urticaria, which is a rash from allergies, and a lot of the patients really like topical. And by the way, just because you pick one method does not mean you have to stick with that. You can mix and match. I have patients that have such terrible sleep disorders. They can't fall asleep and they can't stay asleep. And so to fall asleep, they'll use a vaporizer to get them sleepy right then and there, and then they will have taken an edible maybe an hour or two before, and by the time that kicks in, that's kind of covering them until morning. And so it kind of it allows them to fall asleep, and then the edible allows them to stay asleep. So sometimes we can be creative by mixing and matching. Now, John, you mentioned suppositories, and so this is something that comes up pretty much daily in my world. We don't have enough research. That's the bottom line, and that's kind of true of everything we do with cannabis, but there's not enough research to know really why it seems to work with some people, because there are certainly anecdotal stories of people who are using rectal suppositories and their cancer is going away or their pain is going away. And then there are the studies. And so the studies show that really human beings do not absorb cannabis. Remember, the compounds in cannabis are lipids, they're fats. And studies show that we just do not absorb fats very well through the rectal tissue. And most of the suppositories are the cannabis compounds, which are fats mixed with more fats. So that doesn't seem to work. There was a study that it was done where they took THC and they made a preparation with a compound called hemisuccinate. This is not something that the average person has access to. It's not something that cannabis suppliers have access to. It's something that you'd have to have in a laboratory or a pharmacist involved. But it did show that having that hemisuccinate attached to the THC linked to it helped it absorb. And so what we know about hemisuccinate is that it's water soluble. So that may be why it helps absorb it in through the rectal tissue. I don't like to discount anecdotal stories. People who have used suppositories who say it worked for them. Now, possibly, let's say you're fighting cancer and you also did a nutritional program and you did some type of other treatment. It's certainly possible you can attribute your good results to the cannabis, but remember too, you're doing other things. And so maybe it was one of these other things, but maybe it was all of it together. I think right now, since the jury's out and when I'm seeing someone who's very, very sick, I get a little nervous about recommending something where science doesn't back me up, and it is just anecdotal. So there are, I know, a lot of cannabis suppliers who swear by their suppositories, and maybe they're using some type of preparation that is absorbed better. Remember, this is not standardized medicine. And so when somebody says, oh, rectal suppositories work for me, and the other person says it didn't work for me, okay, first, you're two different human beings, but also maybe the preparations that you're using are different.
Gotcha. And so I'm going to go two things here. So back to edibles, and we work with a lot of seniors that prefer edibles because they think, okay, great little cookie or a brownie. They don't realize sometimes it's a 100 milligram product, and they'll eat that and they won't feel anything for 45 minutes to an hour, and they eat another cookie. Next thing you know, they run in, you know, they're being rushed to the emergency room. What are your thoughts about that? And then also drug-to-drug interactions. We have a lot of seniors and a lot of patients that are taking other pharmaceuticals, and they're used to their pharmaceuticals on a daily basis, and they try cannabis, 2 to 5 milligrams, and next thing you know, they are spinning. Can't. I mean, they're holding the walls up, or the walls are holding them up. Sure. You know, so have you experienced when it will intensify a pharmaceutical?
Sure. So the first part of your question was about the edibles with elderly patients. And so I caution every single patient that comes in about reading labels, making sure they know what is in if they happen to buy a product, they read the label. How much is in the total package, right? And don't read what it says on the package is a serving size or a dose. Go by the dosing that I'm telling you, which again, for THC is very, very low. One doesn't need to start with big milligram doses. But at the same time, also with elderly patients, other than patients that come in with only insomnia, and most of them, that's not the problem. Handful of patients do come in, it's only sleep related. Most patients can benefit from combination CBD THC. Having CBD in the product helps protect against some of the adverse side effects of THC. So when you have high CBD and lower THC, that amount of CBD helps to dampen down the negative side effects or the unwanted side effects of THC, you know, particularly anxiety or agitation that can be provoked by too much THC, or paranoia that is often described. Tachycardia, so a fast heart rate, that can be blocked by CBD. And so when I explain to patients, I have a little chart that I give out that has all the different cannabinoids, and I say, we really don't want just isolated THC. It's not very balanced unless really you're going to sleep. And if you're going to sleep, very tiny doses do the trick. So I just think it's really important for everybody who's out there to make sure that they're telling new and inexperienced patients little baby doses are just fine. In terms of redosing, a lot of people make the mistake, oh, it's 20 minutes in and I don't feel anything, let me take more. Again, one of the other things you have to teach people is you may have to wait 1 to 3 hours. I think sometimes there's this, by the time somebody gets to cannabis, again, because of the stigma and the kind of the negative feelings that many people grew up with, that's kind of been instilled in so many of us, don't do drugs and that, even still to this day, some people are saying people who use cannabis are bad people. By the time people sometimes circle around to cannabis, they're really desperate. And they just really, I just want to sleep tonight. I just need to get that sleep. And I've had patients tell me, oh, well, it seemed like you told me to take such a little amount. So I had this cute lady in my office. She was 75 years old. She was a pistol. And she came back to see me and I saw her in my waiting room. I thought, oh, what's going on? And she said, I just want to tell you the first night I overdosed. I made my husband stay up with me all night because she couldn't believe that such a tiny amount would work. So she took more. She did exactly the opposite of what I told her to do. And it turns out that she was able to get a great night's sleep on 5 milligrams of THC. And so she had found a product where she was able to cut the chocolate bar into, I think, 18 pieces. Very cost-effective way for her to take her medicine. And again, that kind of came around by trial and error. But at the same time, we just have to be very careful. Now, in respect to other medications and drug-drug interactions, it is important that if you're on other medications that you go over this with either a pharmacist or the physician that's helping you. There was a wonderful article that just came out about drug interactions on a physician website, which I can share with United Patients Group if you want to repost that. But it kind of went through the various drugs. Warfarin is a very common blood thinner that people are using, and THC can interact with warfarin. The seizure medications that I see in pediatric patients often do interact with CBD because they're metabolized in the same part of the liver. And so this has been looked at, and there are some very nice articles out there that talk about drug interactions. I think it's very important to get the information, though, from a pharmacist or a healthcare professional, because I have seen some inaccurate information on like forums or posts where people think, oh, I heard this, and then they post it. In general, what I tell patients is that if you're taking a drug that has that can have an intoxicating effect, but you are trying cannabis as a substitute for that drug, is to try cannabis first when you're at home, and then, if you're not getting the effect after a few hours, if you want to take the medication, let's say a sleeping pill or an anxiety pill, that's fine that you can do that, but do not take them at the same time. I have a patient who told me he took THC, I can't remember if it was a lollipop or something like that, and then like an hour later took his Xanax, and he said he basically spent the evening lying on the rug in front of the couch because he couldn't make it to the bedroom. Now, he did end up sleeping, but he said it would have been nice if he could have made it to his bed. And I had warned him about it, but he, sometimes you make mistakes. The beauty of cannabis is that there is no lethal overdose. It can be psychologically uncomfortable if you take too much THC, but there are antidotes, CBD, and some other things that you can try to counteract. Pine nuts and lemonade will sometimes counteract because you're looking at pinene and limonene, two terpenoids that are in those compounds that can help counteract a quote overdose. But it can be very uncomfortable if you overdo THC, and it can scare you. I've had patients who it was the first and only time that they were willing to use THC. It's not very psychologically comfortable if you have a bad reaction like that. But again, it's not fatal. I oftentimes tell my patients if they do overdose or they get a funny reaction, I say, well, the worst thing that can happen happened, and here you are talking to me. So, that's pretty good.
I had a quick question back at the beginning when you were first talking about the different applications, whether it's brownies or a candy or a chocolate bar, or then you said sublingual application of tinctures, vaporization. My question is, do we have any data on how much medicine is getting into your system? For instance, if you're treating, or a patient is being treated for a certain type of cancer, and okay, my father did a sublingual fecal oil, but somebody else might say, no, I'd much rather do the chocolate bars. Are we treating the condition the same? Or is there something different in the way those molecules get into the body and how they actually interact? Or maybe it's the same.
Well, I think I understand your question. So again, every person's different in the way that they absorb and metabolize, and again, the way they respond, which is through the endocannabinoid system. It's very hard to measure how much somebody, unless you do blood work, right, to check levels to see how much is actually getting into the bloodstream, and therefore, you know, that's the aim, is to get it, of course, into the bloodstream, except for topical. And so if there's only a handful of studies, and most of them are old, looking at absorption and what we call the pharmacokinetics, which is how you absorb, how it's metabolized, where it's stored in the body, how you excrete it. And so, for instance, the studies show that if you take sublingual or edible, it's really, absorption is somewhere between 4 and 25%. It's really not that great. So if I tell somebody to take, let's say, you know, aim for a dose of 100 milligrams, they may not be getting 100 milligrams. They may be getting 4, or they might be getting 25. What's interesting about the gut is that, you know, it's a very dynamic physiologic structure, right? So you're absorbing, there's you know, enzymes and acids, and then, you know, peristalsis and absorption going on, and then excretion. I mean, it's this crazy system that's going on we don't even think about unless we don't feel well through our gut. But what's amazing is that you can take an edible on one day and absorb very little of it, and you can take the same amount the next day and absorb a lot of it. So absorption through the gut is quite variable. And studies show sublingually that it's also fairly low absorption, but that it's less likely to be so variable. It's a little bit more consistent. But look, I have patients that come in. I have this one particular patient. She's just lovely. She's a grandmother to, I think, you know, 10 grandkids. She has successfully treated her anxiety and insomnia with a very small dose of a chocolate candy bar. She gets the same results. She takes it the same time at night. She's been able to get off her sleeping pills and her anxiety medication, and it's the same for her. I have other patients who say, I can't regulate it. Well, there you go. Different between different people. So I don't presume to know when somebody walks in the door how they're going to respond to a certain way. I always ask everybody, have you used cannabis before? When did you try it? How did you take it? Do you know what it was? Because that does give clues to how somebody might respond. But, you know, many people say, oh, I smoked it back in the 60s and I haven't touched it since. Well, you know, we're kind of starting over. But I do ask, did you like it? Did you not like it? Oh, no, I didn't like it. I was paranoid, and my sister had to lay in the bed with me to make sure that I, you know, didn't freak out. Or other people say, oh, yeah, it was really pleasant. I loved it. Sometimes that gives you clues into how somebody may respond. But at the same time, you know, we're kind of talking about a completely different era. We've got now medicine that we know what's in it. We have some dosing, some milligram dosing. And again, it doesn't always reflect what somebody will absorb, but at least we know that we can avoid going overboard, and we can try to find the dose that works. So I encourage people to experiment with cannabis. Some people get lucky and the first thing they try works. I recently had a woman that came in and said, I know that my friend wasn't supposed to give me any, but she did, and I took this little spray under my tongue, and I felt normal for the first time in 10 years. Well, you know, I'm not going to mess with that. It worked for her. But I have other patients who, you know, they have to try 10, 12 different products before they actually land on something that works.
And so with that being said, so a lot of patients that have written in to our webinar series here, excuse me there, webinar series here is they say, which follows up what you're saying right here is, or goes together is, can a patient become addicted or tolerant to the effects of cannabis? So if someone, I think a lot of people have that fear and stigma of addiction. And the gateway drug. What are your thoughts about that?
Okay, so it's a great question because I see that as well. I get people that come in and say, well, I'm sober and I'm not. And I say, well, this is not about recreational use. This is about medical use, right? But we've all been kind of propagandized that cannabis is addictive, and it's not really accurate. There are governmental studies that show that in recreational users of THC-rich cannabis, that about 8 to 9% of people in that group, recreational users, not medical, but recreational, will have a dependency. And so kind of what does that mean? Well, dependent means like they like it and they want to use it and they really don't want to stop using it. If you can't walk away from something, you are likely dependent on it, right? And so we used to think that it was just a psychological dependency, and there's still some people saying that, but a physical withdrawal syndrome has been described, and that does mean that for some people there's a physical dependency. And again, it's under 10% of recreational users, and I would guess that with medical patients, it's even less than that, because I will tell you that my medical patients are not interested in adding a new medical problem to their list. They are trying to use cannabis as their answer to their medical issues. And so the physical dependency usually can look like, so someone who's chronic heavy user of THC-rich cannabis, they abruptly stop, and they may find that, and it's similar to caffeine withdrawal, headache, irritability, poor sleep, some stomach upset. I will tell you that the biggest fight I ever had with my husband was on day 4 of caffeine withdrawal. Okay, so it is not something that it's not great, but it definitely won't kill you. But he handed me a Diet Coke and said, drink this. So anyway, but I just find that it's not such a big deal. Now, so that's dependency, right? Now, what is tolerance? So tolerance is something different. What tolerance means that just a higher dose is needed to give the same effect. And so it's really important that people understand this. THC is the only cannabinoid that we know of that causes tolerance. CBD does not cause tolerance. The acid forms, so CBDA, THCA does not cause tolerance. Now, why is this? THC is the molecule, the compound that directly binds to the cannabinoid receptor. Okay, remember, we don't have those receptors for THC. We have those receptors for compounds, our inner cannabis that we make as part of our endocannabinoid system. When THC binds to that receptor, the receptor obviously then triggers the cell, kind of sends a message to the cell for it to change its message. So let's say it's a receptor on a cell that's sending the message of nausea. When THC binds to that receptor, the message sent to the cell is, hey, turn off the nausea message, okay? If you inundate cannabinoid receptors with THC, what can happen is that the receptors, it's almost like I call it a self-preservation mechanism. The receptors are, these are receptors that are working to maintain balance. Well, now they're detecting this imbalanced state of overwhelming amounts of THC. What's been shown is that the receptors that normally sit on the cell wall will internalize and kind of hide inside the cell, and then THC can no longer bind. Now, if THC, you're still taking THC, but your receptor numbers go down, now you have to take more THC to saturate to enhance and saturate the receptors that are still left over. And there was a very nice study where they did this in rats, where they showed that very high dose of THC decreased receptor numbers. And when they took away the THC, the beauty is that those receptors detect that, oh, it's not there anymore, and kind of get what I call the message of all clear, and those receptors can come back out. So if you develop tolerance to THC, look, I have some patients with severe PTSD, severe pain, that use lots of THC. What I encourage them to do is a few things. One is try to skip a day if you can. And if you can't skip a day of using THC, then every 3 months, try to take a week off. It's not the easiest thing to do. I wouldn't pick a week that your mother-in-law's visiting or some other stressful situation, but go ahead and try to plan what we call kind of a break, right? A THC break. The other thing that you can do, and I find this is very helpful, is that if you incorporate CBD into your regimen, and you have CBD in there. CBD doesn't work directly at the receptor site, but it modulates the way THC binds to the receptor, and it also does some of the heavy lifting for the medical condition. So combination CBD and THC is very nice for many conditions, but having that CBD present will help minimize some of that tolerance to THC. There are studies on a pharmaceutical form of CBD THC that's out there, not in the United States, but in Europe and some other countries. And they showed that tolerance does not build, and this is a combination CBD THC. So that's really where that research comes from. And I find that in my clinical experience that I can back that up. There's no question that when people incorporate other cannabinoids that don't work at the necessarily right directly at the receptor, that they do minimize tolerance. One other thing I want to comment on is that remember that if you have an imbalance in your endocannabinoid system that creates a medical condition and you are successfully treating that medical condition with cannabinoids from the plant, phytocannabinoids, often what happens is the endocannabinoid system gets itself back into balance. And once it's in balance, you don't need as much medicine. So I have heard from patients year after year in my practice, you know, when I came here, I was desperate, I felt terrible, and I used more cannabis then. And I don't know, I just don't need as much now. I really don't, you know, I use it just as needed 3 times a week, you know, once a week. Why is that? Did they get better and they just don't need more? Well, likely because it's working so well. We know it's working, that's where it works, at the endocannabinoid system. But it is, what's happening is their endocannabinoid system, instead of being out of whack like this, it's here, and it's kind of like working out. You know, once you're in shape, it's a lot easier to stay in shape. Getting into shape is a real bear. And so once you get, I always tell people, once you kind of get into balance, if you moderate your use, you are very likely to really stay in a very nice, balanced, what we call endocannabinoid tone. Everything is kind of staying balanced. And you may have, you know, something happen in life that kind of tips you over. You get sick, or, you know, some kind of drama in your life that creates anxiety. You may need a little bit more cannabis at that time. But in general, I just find that people find that they just don't need more. And this is like the opposite of many medications. You know, with opiates, we usually have to escalate dose in order to get benefits, right? But with cannabis, a lot of times, especially if you're incorporating other cannabinoids other than THC, you can really stay in balance once you get there.
Gotcha. And it will save a lot of money. We have a lot of patients that call and say, you know, I don't have a lot of money. And so, like you said, if you can find something that fits you, as it's not a one-size-fits-all, in turn, it does cut down on the expenditure, monthly expenditure. And Corinne, I think you had a question as well?
Yeah, I had a question, and we kind of covered it, but just for the people who are listening in, the term therapeutic window, I know we kind of went around the whole thing, but can you just explain what the therapeutic window is? And it sounds to me like we all have a different therapeutic window, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, to me, the therapeutic window is the range of dosing that works. And remember, it can be a range. It may not be just one dose, one point. It may be a range. But also, we have to remember that our symptoms are not always the same. So I have patients that will come to see me and say they have 10 out of 10 migraines, but they also have these other headaches, and they're not migraines. They don't get nauseated. They don't have the light sensitivity. Like, they know there are different kinds of headaches, and they know that one dose will treat the migraine and a different dose will treat the other kind of headache, or one they need more THC when they have a migraine, or they use something with a little more CBD. So therapeutic window to me is just kind of that range of what works for you. And it varies. I, again, have patients, and like kind of the best example I can give is that my pediatric patients that I take care of who have epilepsy, there are kids that take low dose and their seizures are controlled and they're doing very well. And then I have kids completely opposite end of the range with very high dose CBD, maybe in combination with some of the other cannabinoids as well. You know, again, we're unique individuals, and how we respond to cannabis is going to be different. To me, therapeutic window is what works for you, but it can be a range. I will tell you, so I have this elderly gentleman that I take care of, and he wants to ensure that he gets his good night's sleep. And he uses a cannabis oil that's 4 parts CBD to 1 part THC, and I think it helps his arthritis. So at the end of the day, when he's achy, it helps take care of his pain, but it also helps him with sleep. And the last time he came in, he had told me, and I thought he was kind of on a high dose. I mean, again, it was working for him. And I said, you know, maybe you can back up. How did you end up there? He goes, oh, I just jumped up to it, and it's working. It's great. But he was also complaining about the cost of it. I said, well, let's see if we can, you know, like, I'm not sure why you're at that dose. Maybe a little bit lower will work, or a little bit lower. And sure enough, we were able to find that he still had a great night's sleep and pain relief at half the dose that he thought he needed. And so even though, and I think part of it was he just had so much anxiety about sleeping, he wanted to sleep, and I don't blame him, but it was that he was so afraid to have a night where he didn't sleep. And remember, if you take a dose and it doesn't work, you can always redose. Sometimes, you know, once you take too much, you have to kind of ride it out. And again, if it's THC, it can be a little uncomfortable. But in general, I think that everybody does have their own therapeutic window. And you know, often I get a question like, okay, what strain do you recommend for Parkinson's disease? Who's Parkinson's? How far into it are they? What other drugs are they on? Have they ever used cannabis before?
So Bonnie, just closing up on this whole therapeutic window, there are some people out there that'll say, you know, if you take too much, if you oversaturate the receptors, that the medicine's not going to work anyway. And I understand what you said about how we all have different therapeutic window. I totally agree with that. Is there a point to where the body may just get overloaded and not receive or absorb the medicine, or we all absorb, it's just a different point for everyone? I guess that's kind of redundant.
No, I can answer. So again, it's going back to, if you're talking about THC-rich medicine, you have to remember that you're talking about THC that binds to the receptors, and you know, this is scientifically known and studied, that if the overall number of receptors go down, you are going to lose some of the therapeutic value. Okay, very important to understand too that the receptors can, and we call this down regulating of the receptors. When you have less numbers, what happens is those receptors hide inside the cell, they internalize. You can have one part of the brain down regulate receptors, but another part doesn't. So there are people who, quote, get used to the high, but it still works for their pain. And they'll say to you, I don't feel high, but it takes my pain away. And other people look at them and think, oh yeah, right. But the reality is that can happen once somebody is using the medicine on a regular basis. There's no question that that can happen. So the brain has like selective downregulation, or selective kind of areas that become tolerant and some areas don't. So that's part of that. When you say saturate, I mean, we're talking about CBD. There is this concept out there that's been kind of thrown around, and I've thrown it around too, called CBD saturation. And it's something that I have seen in my pediatric epilepsy patients who are taking 3 doses daily of a high dose CBD rich medicine to control seizures. And it appears that it's, we don't know really why this happens, and it's been termed CBD saturation. And someone explained it to me with an analogy, like the brain is a sponge. And if you take a sponge and you fill it with water, no more water can get into it. You have to let it kind of dry out a little bit before you can add more medicine. And so sometimes in a child, what will happen is they're cooking along, doing great, and then the parent will say, oh, you know what, my child started having seizures. You know, we lost some of the benefits. And then the seizures are there, and they're not there because we weaned a medicine, and they're not having seizures because they're sick. It just kind of came out of the blue. And I'll tell the parent, let's skip a dose, the next dose or the next 2 doses, next 3 doses of CBD and see if the seizures stop. And over 90% of cases that I've done this in, the seizures stop. And really what it is that it's, again, it possibly could be that the endocannabinoid system, which was imbalanced, is now in better balance, and you just don't need as much. It's in a more balanced state. We really don't know, but that's kind of what, I've talked to colleagues about this, and that's what we theorize. And of course, until we can do more studies, it's hard to know. Clinically, I just get a sense for it, I think, because I take care of so many kids with epilepsy, but it's not always. About 90% of those kids where we've stopped have actually gotten better, and for other kids, it may just be loss of effect, or that for whatever reason, maybe absorption has changed, right? Because we can always go back and say, well, maybe they're not, if there's a stomach flu or something else that's going on that may be, subclinical, that's not super apparent. But at the same time, there's so much left to understand. And, really one of my biggest concerns is that even though I've been doing this a long time, my motto, which all doctors take this oath, do no harm. Cannabis in general is very, very safe, and I feel very comfortable, recommending it and helping people. But sometimes these things pop up, and we don't have an explanation, and that's really why research is so important.
Education. Can I ask you about THCA and CBDA? Have you ever seen that combination bring on a high?
So for those people listening, THCA is the raw form of THC that's found in the raw plant. CBDA is also the raw form of CBD that's found in the raw plant. And we used to think that these compounds were not medically active. We talk about, you have to activate the raw plant by heating it up to create THC and CBD. But it turns out that these compounds are anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. They're antiemetic. THCA is anticonvulsant. They both have cancer-fighting properties. And so in general, when I have had patients use preparations, by the way, since you can't heat them up, there's only a few ways you can take THCA and CBDA, and that's either as raw plant, meaning you're eating the plant or juicing the plant and not heating it up, or it can come in a liquid form that's basically like an oil that just hasn't been heated up in the preparation. It's almost like, I call it like cold pressed juice. It's just, it's made with without any heat. There is a small amount of THC in the THCA for some compounds. So I've seen one compound in particular. So let's say it's got 20 parts THCA and 1 part THC. Again, unless you're very, very not, what we call cannabis naive and never used THC before, potentially if you took a lot of that, you could have the intoxicating effects. However, for most patients using small doses of these raw cannabinoids, we're not seeing intoxication. I would like to say that I just kind of did a review of all the THCA literature, and THCA, if you are using it, should be refrigerated. If you leave it out at room temperature for, I think it was 10 days in the study, about 25% of it converted to THC. And it's interesting when you read the studies, and there's a very recent study that just came out that's a really nice review of THCA. I think it was done by Dr. John McPartland and his and maybe somebody else in there as well. I apologize to the researcher if I didn't get your name, but they showed that that THCA is, they call it a chemically unstable compound. It wants to convert to THC. It's, if it sits around, it's going to convert eventually. And so when you're studying THCA, so think about this, you isolate a compound, right? and you want to know what it does. But as you're studying it, it keeps converting to another compound that has medical effects. So how do you isolate this compound and keep it from converting? So what we know about THCA, we think we know, but maybe it's attributable to some of the THC in there. But I will tell you that, so for instance, in my pediatric patients, some of them don't respond very well to CBD or don't respond at all. We will try a THCA oil to see if we can get some anticonvulsant effects. And I have some patients getting some amazing results. And the parents know if their child's intoxicated. These kids are not intoxicated. They're going to school. They're learning. They're moving forward developmentally. And so I really do believe that it's the THCA that is working for these kids.
Gotcha. And you mentioned a couple weeks ago, I mentioned this on the show, that I left the house, ran to the office, but prior to that, I took our daily dose of THCA for health and wellness. And I got to the office, and my employees started looking at me and say, "What's wrong with you?" And I was loopy as loopy. And I called Corinne. I said, "That bottle we had at home that's been sitting on our I guess not bedside table, but it was in the window, so in the middle of the day, the sunlight's on it all day long. And, I'm only seeing it in the morning when it's shadowed, but it converted. And so I told Corinne, toss that away, get that. So I've seen that happen. And I'm a perfect example of it happening too. So this question always comes up. It's about different types of cancers. And have you ever come across hormone-driven cancers versus other cancers? A lot of people have seen hormone-driven cancers. I shouldn't say they've heard that hormone-driven cancers can spread with a high dose of THC. Have you run into that?
Well, John, so we don't know. Okay, again, another thing that just has not been studied enough. There was a study in mice that had breast cancer implanted, breast cancer cell line implanted, and these were mice that had no immune system whatsoever, and when THC was given, it caused these cells to multiply. So can we take that information and then apply it to human beings who have breast cancer? And I don't think that the answer is yes. I don't think that I can say that patients who have breast cancer are like these mice that have no immune system. I mean, we know that you can give chemotherapy to a patient and kind of wipe out some of their immunity, but that doesn't mean that it's the same as a mouse bred with no immunity whatsoever, and that THC in that particular patient's going to drive it. There is a concern that it could happen. Again, I've talked about it with colleagues, but there's anecdote after anecdote of patients using THC in a breast cancer that has hormone receptor positive, that it did not advance. So where the cancer it may have gone away actually. So again, the jury's out, and it's really, really hard to take a sweeping kind of generalized approach, because not every breast cancer is the same. Not every patient is the same. And when you look at the DNA of these cancers, they're different. Doctors do the best they can, again, to do no harm and to try to save lives. When I have a patient that comes in who's doing really well, I'll be honest with you, they don't really want to take a lot of THC, because that means they can't drive their car. That means they're sedated the whole day, kind of what you described about your father-in-law, that if he took very high dose, he might be wiped out, right? And he spends the whole day sleeping. Now, with patients who have very advanced cancers who are already somewhat debilitated and we're trying to save their lives, for many of those patients, they'll take high-dose THC because they're behind the 8 ball. But there are a lot of patients that come in who are, breast cancer now is almost like a chronic condition. I just saw a patient today who's 4 years into her treatment, and, you would never know. She has her hair. She doesn't look terribly like cachectic or very, very thin. If she was walking down the street, you would never know that she was ill with metastatic stage 4 breast cancer. And so, I had a long talk with her about THC, and she said to me, "I'd rather just use CBD," which by the way, there's lots of studies that show that CBD helps kill breast cancer cells. I'm very careful when I'm talking about cancer and cannabis because, again, we have 2 human trials, period. And both done in Europe, both done with glioblastoma multiforme, which is a very aggressive brain cancer. And so everything else we have, we're kind of extrapolating from animal data and from test tube data. And, you know, again, knowing that cannabis is very safe, I feel very comfortable telling patients, oh, I think you should try it, or maybe it's not indicated in your case. But the reality is that for many people, it's going to help them get through their cancer, and it's going to hopefully enhance their chemo or their radiation effects. And, you know, if nothing else, it kind of allows people to pass without having to take lots and lots of drugs.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know you're a big advocate of CBD, but can you share with our listeners tonight that THC, a lot of people say, oh, THC is the bad part of the cannabis plant, where CBD is the medical portion. Can you add to that?
Sure. So I even write in my book, THC is not recreational only. Okay, it is the compound that binds to the receptor, the cannabinoid receptor, to help the messages become balanced. If you do not make your natural cannabis-like compounds called endocannabinoids, you are what we would call endocannabinoid deficient. And CBD and these other cannabinoids may not do the trick, where THC goes in and binds directly to that receptor and gives the benefit. I have a lot of patients who came to me and said, I don't want to take THC, and guess what they've ended up taking for their medical condition? THC. It's very important that people understand that there is a medical dose and there is a recreational dose with a little overlap between the two. What is the goal of a recreational dose? The goal is to become high, to be intoxicated, and so on. What's the goal of a medical dose? The goal of a medical dose is to treat the medical condition. And you can successfully treat a medical condition with THC as long as you're aware of what you're taking. When we look at kids, teenagers, and young people who are experimenting with cannabis, and they're just kind of, you know, smoking pot to get high, so to speak, they're not thinking about, oh, my back hurts, and maybe I'll just try a little bit and then reassess. What I tell my patients is take a dose and stop, very small amount, and wait and see what the effect is. You may find that all of a sudden your back stopped hurting, you are not high, you feel great, and you can still do all the things that you want to do and actually be very functional. So we have to remember that most of us are introduced to this in a recreational setting, so that's kind of what's implanted in our brain. And we have to remember that that's not what most medical patients are doing. They want to be able to use whatever compound in cannabis works. When I have patients, and for instance, this little boy I mentioned already who has leukemia, when he is getting a very high steroid dose as part of his chemotherapy or his treatment for his leukemia, very high steroids make you feel terrible. You don't sleep, you don't eat, you're cranky, you're fussy. This little boy gets a very low dose, a couple of drops of THC under his tongue, and the parents are like, oh, he's just back to normal. How is that not medical? This is not a child who even knows what he's taking. So it's really important to understand that THC is a medical compound. When somebody takes it to just get high, well, then it's a recreational compound. But, you know, intention is everything. Some patients are struggling so much with their, let's say, a chronic pain condition. You know, I have people that come in and I look at their MRI or whatever, and they've got a crushed vertebra. They've got really some significant damage. Someone's in a bad car accident or motorcycle accident. They're stuck with that injury for the rest of their lives. And they don't get to take their back off, you know, leave it on the desk at home and go on vacation, right? They have to somehow be able to put one step in front of the other day by day. And so for some people, tipping into that intoxicating or that kind of feel good, but, you know, maybe don't drive your car, effect is very helpful for some people. It allows them to get respite, which I mentioned before. It allows them to kind of turn off, reset, and then take on another day.
Well said, well said. And I'm going to finish up with this one question that I've asked all of our guests. Can you tell me, is there a difference between hemp CBD versus cannabis CBD?
Okay, so again, a loaded question. Okay, CBD is a compound, a molecular structure. You can go online and type in CBD molecule, and the little chemical structure will pop up. CBD in hemp is the same molecule as CBD in, quote, the drug variety. So you have to remember, hemp is the fiber variety, and quote, the drug variety is what we, kind of term marijuana. I call it cannabis, but really the cannabis species is both the fiber variety and the drug variety. What's missing from the hemp plant is all the other cannabinoids and terpenoids and flavonoids and all of these compounds that make up what Dr. Meshulam in Israel, who initially isolated THC and has spent the last 50 years researching cannabis for its therapeutic value, what he terms the entourage effect. CBD as a single molecule, I have found, only treats a handful of conditions and in certain people. So no question that it helps people with epilepsy, especially children with intractable epilepsy. There are human trials that show that it helps people with schizophrenia with very high doses. But by itself, and again, another really elegant study done in Israel, shows that single molecule CBD, which is what you would find in the hemp plant for the most part, has a bell-shaped curve of therapeutic value, meaning you can increase the dose, and at a certain point you lose the therapeutic value as you go higher. When you use whole plant CBD, i.e. the drug variety that's combined with some THC, it doesn't have to be a lot, a little bit, or other cannabinoids, the other terpenoids, the flavonoids that are in the very robust flower that is part of the, quote, marijuana, unquote, drug variety cannabis species. What we see is that CBD kind of is a dose-dependent improvement, and you don't lose that therapeutic value as you increase the dose of CBD. So CBD is not a standalone molecule except in very few conditions. I find that having all those other compounds that are described in that entourage effect, they help do they help with a lot of the heavy lifting for medical conditions and actually make CBD work better. And so if I lived in a state where all I could get was hemp, sure, I think it's okay to try it. But certainly, and this is what I tell my patients who live in California, you live in California, you don't need to use hemp. You can use full spectrum, whole plant cannabis that is grown high in CBD, low THC levels. You don't have to have that intoxicating effect, but you're still getting that full spectrum of terpenoids and the other compounds in the plant.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And I know I'm going to throw one or two, maybe one more questions here. Out of all in your practice, I guess, of all the patients, all the studies that you have had over the years, what are you seeing the most success with? What types of conditions and what types of ratios? And I know you can't really, this isn't medical advice, but our followers and our listeners tonight, love these real stories.
So what I'm seeing is, there's a lot of conditions I see success with. So let's start with kind of the more common ones. So chronic pain. I would say that the majority of patients that come in do get improvement in their pain. I just spoke to an elderly couple today. They used to come see me all the time, but they've moved out of the area, so I do a yearly phone call because they don't drive anymore, and they are able to email me for questions. But both of them have been successfully weaned off opiates for their chronic pain conditions. And so that's something that I see. No question that people are able to get off opiates if that's what they want to do, and that's not an easy thing to do, but if you psychologically decide that I'm going to get off opiates and I'm going to use cannabis to do it, the motivation is a really powerful thing, and people can do that. It's not the easiest thing to do, but they can do it. A lot of patients are able to not escalate their dose of opiates because they're using cannabis, and this is very important when we look at what's going on in our country with the opiate epidemic. So chronic pain is definitely something that people are improving with. I tell patients we've got 4 choices in California, but really 4 general choices, and then it narrows down. But THC-rich cannabis, we've got CBD-rich cannabis, we've got THCA, and we've got CBDA. That's really what we have right now. And there are probably some other cannabinoids coming down the pike, like CBDV, THCV, and so on. But right now, if you walked into a California collective, you're going, oh, and by the way, CBN is also out there, which is cannabinol. So I don't use CBN very often. It's a little bit hard to find. But in general, those 4 categories allow patients to experiment a little bit. And I tell patients, I don't know which one is going to work the best for you, depending on your pain condition, but all of them are anti-inflammatory. All of them are analgesic. So, we'll likely hit on something. And interestingly, at a recent conference I went to, many other clinicians who I spoke to were finding that combinations of the different cannabinoids, again, letting all of them work together in that entourage effect, but also not relying on one to do the heavy lifting, letting all of them work together. We're finding some very nice results. And it's always interesting when you're, like I'm in my little office seeing patients, not necessarily talking to a lot of clinicians until I see them at a conference, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, I'm doing that too. Oh, you're getting success. So we really, we collaborate that way, but we also know that what we're doing is really valid. Under the CBD-rich category, there's CBD dominant, like very high CBD, like 25-to-1, 20-to-1, and then there's down to 4-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1 ratios. When we're talking about ratios, how much CBD to how much THC, so something like 25-to-1 is 25 parts CBD to 1 part THC, or 4-to-1 is 4 parts CBD to 1 part THC. They're going to work differently for different people. For those people who don't want to necessarily have any intoxicating effect, you can start with CBD products and try the raw cannabinoids, THCA and CBDA, and then add in small doses of THC as needed to see if it helps. No question, I have lots of patients responding who have anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders. Many of those go together. And remember too, when you have chronic pain, you don't sleep and you're anxious and depressed. So the combination, the beauty is cannabis treats all of that. People with inflammatory conditions like autoimmune inflammatory conditions, people with gut, so Crohn's, IBS is something that I do see a lot of patients who are doing very well. We do think that IBS is related to an endocannabinoid deficiency. So by taking cannabinoids, you're replacing the deficiency and getting back into balance, excuse me. We also are seeing patients with being successful in pediatrics with epilepsy, autism, and any kind of like severe psychological or psychiatric illness. And one condition in particular called PANDAS, which is a like post-streptococcal or post-infectious inflammation of the brain that kind of makes the child kind of go a little crazy. And I am seeing some very nice results in a small percentage of patients that I'm seeing that, or I should say it's just a small number of patients that I'm seeing with PANDAS. But a lot of success in people with phantom limb pain. That's one that you don't hear a lot about, but I have a lot of patients that definitely are getting some good results with that. Elderly patients who just kind of hurt all over and have polypharmacy oftentimes will find a sense of well-being with cannabis, and they are able to get off some of the drugs that they're taking. And so, again, there are people who say, how can cannabis treat so many things? And you have to remember that we have these receptors, and where the receptors are located kind of dictates the condition. So remember, the receptors are located in the brain in the areas of pain, nausea, vomiting, motor, memory and learning, anxiety, emotion, but also we have these receptors in our gut, we have these receptors in our immune system and some other places. So this is why we see so many different conditions responding to cannabis.
Gotcha. So last week or the week before at our live Q&A, we had a woman who called in about pandas.
Oh,
And I had not heard of it, but I did mention that you would be coming on, and so hopefully, if you're watching this tonight, the woman who asked that question, please join us this Thursday for a live Q&A, and Dr. Goldstein can probably touch more upon that as well. And I know I promise you we can get out of here. So I know you have the most known common cannabinoids that we're seeing here in California: THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA. Can you tell us, just in Cliff Note version, the benefits of each? And are there any popular, what are the most common flavonoids and terpenes that you're seeing out there? And for terpenes, I know we have Miriam's Hope coming on here in a couple weeks, and they'll be talking about how to safely make your own cannabis oil, and they're a company that includes terpenes into their oils. And then I'm going to do one more plug. So next week's Q&A, live Q&A, as well as the webinar here, we will have Enresco Lab talking about quality control, how to tell the good from the bad. But back to you, Bonnie, if you can just in closing here, talk about
sure.
the benefits of those cannabinoids, and then if you can talk about the most popular flavonoids and terpenes that you're seeing out there right now.
So if we start with THC, there's a long list of benefits. So neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory, antiemetic, meaning it stops nausea and vomiting, analgesic. Now, for some people want to forget things, that's a good thing, like PTSD. So it can have some memory loss, but certainly if you don't want that, then that's not an effect that you want. Let's see, enhancing appetite. For some people, it actually enhances learning. So some patients who have ADHD, who struggle with memory retention and with focus and learning, THC can actually give them that. And some people, it can actually take away their focus. But remember, if there's an imbalance going on, for some people, it can actually create the balance. CBD is well known to be a potent anti-inflammatory and anticonvulsant, antipsychotic, antiemetic. It helps reduce spasticity and muscle spasms. Neuroprotective. Let's see what else. THCA is known to be anticonvulsant, antiemetic, anti-inflammatory. CBDA, and I may be forgetting things here, but in the interest of time, THCA also anti-tumor, as well as THC and CBD being anti-tumor. CBDA is a potent anti-inflammatory, anti-tumor, antiemetic as well. And so what was your second part of your question, John?
Flavonoids and terpenes.
So the terpenes, look, in California, a lot of the cannabis has been crossbred, and so many of the terpenes are kind of being repeated. The terpenes that are kind of most well-known, myrcene, which is cross-species with hops and rosemary. Myrcene can give a sedating effect. It's also anti-cancer, and myrcene is in most of the cannabis that's in California. Pinene is a terpenoid that helps with its bronchodilation, so it helps open up the lungs. It helps enhance memory. Some people say that it helps promote focus. Linalool is a compound that's cross-species with lavender and some other plants, and it's very relaxing. In fact, I just read a study yesterday that if you put lavender oil in your baby's bath, your baby will cry less during the bath and sleep better after the bath, which is very interesting because the babies don't know what they're bathing in. So I don't think it's a placebo effect. but it's also anticonvulsant, and limonene is another one that we're seeing a lot of. Limonene is found in the rind of cross species in the rinds of citrus. And, you know, sometimes you'll hear about lemon kush or pineapple haze. These contain limonene. Limonene's a nice antidepressant, anti-anxiety. It also helps with acid reflux. Flavonoids are interesting because they're really not been looked at, and they're not really measured. And so there's just a handful of them out there, but flavonoids in general are anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. There is some research that shows they're anti-aging. We know that there's cross species of flavonoids that are found in cannabis are also cross species with green tea, which we know we should be drinking, berries, which we know we should be eating. And so Mother Nature kind of gives us this bounty, and many of these compounds that are found in other healthy plants, you know, fruits, vegetables, and so on, compounds are also found in the cannabis plant, and that's what we are seeing. There is you know, people ask me about this, and I'll be honest, I'm kind of on the fence. There are some companies that are adding medicinal grade terpenoids that are found from that are harvested from other plants into the mix, into their cannabis, so that you can actually buy like a myrcene enhanced oil or a pinene enhanced oil. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, as long as they're both really coming from, or the terpenoids, I'm sorry, are coming from a natural source. There are people who I respect so much in the cannabis industry, people who are growers, people who really know about the plant, and they're purists, and they say we can grow plants that have that. But the reality is that, you know, when you're growing for so many people, I mean, California has so many patients that can benefit from cannabis. It's quite a big task to be able to grow plants that are specific terpenoid profiles when, you know, I mean, I hate to say it like this, when you're growing for the masses of people. So I don't think that necessarily it's a bad thing to add those in, but certainly the ideal would be that a plant has a certain terpenoid profile, and that plant could be relied upon for that profile.
Gotcha. And I told you one last question. This one came up.
Sounds like there is no one last question.
I mentioned this last time. If I say goodbye, if we're having a dinner party, it takes me an hour to say goodbye to everybody. But so you mentioned product, and you saw a product. So Corinne and I just recently saw a product that said, and you mentioned green tea. It was a THCA tea. How does that work? You know, because and is that possible?
Okay, so tea implies that you've heated it up somewhere, right? Yeah. You make even iced tea, you heat up and then cool down.
Exactly.
So I have not seen it. That doesn't make sense to me, because if you heat up THCA, you're going to end up with THC. And again, it's an unstable molecule. Even just leaving it on the counter, it's going to convert. So that doesn't make any sense to me, unless it was, you know, I mean, if you take raw cannabis and just put it in water and let it sit in there, I suppose some of it will leach out. But remember, THCA is a lipid molecule, a fat molecule, and it may not necessarily mix with water. So there is that. You know, they say when you do make cannabis tea, you should add a little fat to it, such as a little milk or butter or cream or something, to enhance the absorption, because it's in water, right? And so that doesn't make sense to me either. Maybe there is someone who can explain it.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. So in closing, first off, Bonnie, you are always the utmost professional, and I appreciate what you do. And Bonnie has traveled with us on the road, educating, and so she's literally the tops of what she does. And she'll be with us this Thursday on a live Q&A. So if you have any questions whatsoever, you know, you can write into us prior, or that night, which will be this Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard. So again, if you have any questions whatsoever in regards to tonight's webinar, please click the link and submit your question, or you can submit questions that night of the webinar as well. So, and also on the webinar, we'll do the live Q&A, but we'll also be giving away 4 one-on-one medical consultations with the United Patients Group approved doctor or nurse, and we hope to see you there. And Bonnie, do you have any closing words for our viewers tonight?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for giving me a chance to share what I know. I will tell you that what I've seen in the last 9 years that I've been doing this has really been very rewarding for me. But we need to really change the way we think about this. You know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but at the same time, what I tell people is if you've had a good experience, you've heard somebody who's done well, tell people, get people on board with this, because there's no reason for people to have unnecessary suffering when we have this plan and we can use it.
Perfect way to end on there. And I'm just going to throw one more disclaimer in here. Again, the information that we covered tonight is not intended to place a one-on-one relationship with your doctor. And so the information that Bonnie has shared is from her personal experience of 9+ years of being one of the top doctors in this medical cannabis industry, not only here in the U.S., but globally. So total honor to have you tonight, and looking forward to our live Q&A Thursday night. And everyone, again, thank you for your support, your letters, your calls. It has been humbling, and I know I share that every week, but it really has been humbling. And to pick up the phone at our office and have someone recognize my voice or Corinne's voice and just say, I'm actually speaking to you, and almost break down in tears, because you know, we give a lot of people hope, and this has been a very educational webinar series that we're doing, and again, we love the feedback. So bless everyone. Bonnie, it's always a pleasure, and thank you for being with us tonight and spending the evening with us. We'll see you Thursday as well. And this is John Malanka with The Sacred Plant, and have a blessed evening. Good night.